Welcome to the Insomnia Project. Sit back, relax, and listen as we have a conversation about the mundane. One thing we can promise you is that our conversation will be hopefully less than fascinating. I know some people find certain topics more fascinating than others, as I received a Instagram post about one particular episode that someone found very interesting. We hope you will just feel free to drift off. Thank you for listening, and we also hope you will listen and sleep. I'm your host, Marco Timpano. I wanted to mention our Patreon page. A lot of people were asking me what exactly is a Patreon page, so I figured I'd let you know. Patreon is a platform that provides creators like us who make this podcast the ability to provide extra content for our subscribers or our listeners or our patrons. And our patrons can donate anything from $1 a month to as high as you want to go. And for $2 a month, you get the package which is called the Sweet Dreamer, which gives you exclusive Daniel Barker content. And the reason I mention this is because my guest today is my father-in-law, Daniel Barker. This will be a 26-minute version of the episode we're recording. But if you go to our Patreon page, which is patreon.com/The Insomnia Project, you can hear this episode in its entirety. I want to welcome my father-in-law, Daniel Barker, to the podcast today. Welcome.
Thank you.
So, I wanted to do this episode about the area of Massachusetts where you grew up, where you were born, and I'm going to call this episode Boston and the South Shore. So what I'd like to do is mention some of the towns and places and areas that I've heard being married to your daughter when she talks about that whole South Shore area, and get your impressions of what that area is like or what it was like when you were growing up there. So let's start with Hanover.
Okay.
Tell me about Hanover.
Well, I will, just so that your listeners understand. I grew up in the 50s and early 60s. So one of the towns that my family moved to when I was 12 was Hanover. And Hanover was a small town, approximately 5,000 people. And it was named after King George, the House of Hanover. So it gives you an idea of the time span here. Prior to that, it was known as Scituate, or South Scituate.
But there is a Scituate, right?
There is still a Scituate, that's correct, right on the water.
And so what would be something you would find in Scituate? Would you find a fisherman there, or is it more of a...
Well, you have lobster fishermen going out of Scituate, but for the most part, it's pleasure boats.
Oh, I see.
And you'd find different marinas there. It's also significantly historic. The famous story of Scituate was when a British man of war during the Revolutionary War came in just outside the harbor, and the locals found out about this, and a half a dozen of them got together. They got a drum. I think they had some firearms, etc. And the sand dunes separated the ship from the actual harbor. Therefore, they started beating the drums and sounding out commands, and sounded like they had an entire army behind those dunes. The British didn't stick around. They took off. They didn't want a conflict. So
there you go. So that's some historic information about Scituate.
Scituate.
Now,
yeah.
you said that you moved to Hanover. Where were you prior to Hanover? Like, where were you born?
Well, I was born in Weymouth, Massachusetts.
That Weymouth, Massachusetts, always is a bit of a bone of contention between me and Amanda, my wife, your daughter,
Yes.
because her passport says she was born in South Weymouth.
That's correct.
She says, no, it's just Weymouth. And so it's always, I say, well, your passport says South Weymouth. It doesn't say Weymouth.
Well, in South Weymouth it is part of Weymouth, but that's where the hospital is located. Our little local hospital, South Shore Hospital, was there. I was born there also. So it's been there for some time.
And Becca and Garrett, were they born there?
I got to stop to think. Yes.
Okay. So you were saying,
Yeah.
the difference between South Weymouth and Weymouth, the hospital is in South Weymouth.
That's right.
But Bostonians or people from Massachusetts would only refer to it as Weymouth, if I understand correctly. They wouldn't distinguish it with South Weymouth or.
No, they most probably would, and the reason is not just the hospital, but in my childhood, a very large naval air base was located there.
In South Weymouth.
In South Weymouth.
I see. And so you were born in Weymouth, but where did you grow up before you moved to Hanover?
Before Hanover, we lived in what was actually public housing for the first couple of years of my life in Weymouth, which was very close to where my father worked at the shipyard in Quincy.
Okay, so Quincy is another area. I have like a list of different.
I know, and
names.
I'm throwing these out at you.
It's great,
and I haven't answered your question yet, but I want to give you the background.
We'll get back to it. Since you've mentioned Quincy, I want to highlight this particular area of the South Shore, and that's because, as I understand it, having been married to a Massachusetts family now, that the proper pronunciation of Quincy is Quincy and not Quincy, even though it is spelt Quincy. And that's how you can tell if someone is from the Boston area and how they pronounce Quincy. And in fact, we went to go see that movie called Manchester by the Sea.
Yes.
That got a lot of attention and whatnot. And we all laughed in the theater. It was just us. We were in Florida watching it when they pronounced it Quincy instead of Quincy. I don't know if you remember that. But anyways, let's get back to Quincy.
Oh, back to Quincy.
Sure.
Okay, sure. Well, Quincy is just located south of Boston and literally right across the Neponset River from South Boston. And Quincy is a city and noted for a few things, of course, named after the Adams family. John Adams lived there back when it was known, I believe, as Braintree.
Which Braintree was, if I'm not mistaken, at one point the last stop on the T in Boston. Is that right?
That's right. Back in the 70s when I was getting my master's degree, I would take it at least every weekend for classes inside Boston at Suffolk University. And it was great because I could get on at Braintree and I get right off right there at Suffolk. So.
And this is not to be mistaken with the Quincy Market.
No.
Which is in Boston proper.
That's right. Right.
Is it named after the town of Quincy?
Well, that's a fair question. Everything is named eventually back to John Quincy Adams,
right?
The son of John Adams. And both father and son were presidents.
Right, and from the Boston area.
From the Boston area.
Now, let's go back. We're just going to keep going back to where you were born. So you were born in South Weymouth, but you lived in, before Hanover?
A town called Rockland.
Okay.
Rockland, the community I really grew up in until age 12, was a post-war development. It was a farmer's field, and it was quite a large one, called Wyman Fields, which is still there. And these are all 3-bedroom, 1-bath, small ranch houses. And I look back very fondly because everybody was in the same boat. We just got through with the Korean War, just got through with World War II. And a lot of the guys coming back, I mean, housing was at a premium and you wanted your own place. And so this development just grew wildly. And the thing is, everybody was the same, i.e., I had so many friends my age,
right,
that we always had baseball games and basketball games and just a lot of good fun times.
So born in South Weymouth, living in Rockland, you moved to Hanover.
Right.
Now, I'm going to take a little detour here to talk about where's the place where you would go buy a turkey. because this is the thing that made me laugh when we were in Massachusetts
Okay.
as a family.
Okay.
There's a specific place.
There is. There were turkey farms around that area. In fact, my first job at age 12 was plucking turkeys. I got 25 cents a tom and 15 cents a hen turkey.
Wow.
So that's what I did after school.
Was it harder to pluck a tom or a male turkey over the hen?
Not necessarily, because you had to get all the little pin feathers, and if you really look, they have the end of the feathers are very hard, and you got to get all of those out.
I see.
The hens, of course, were a little small. The toms were larger to
Oh, I
get
see.
to.
Okay, so that's why. And so you were a turkey plucker?
I was, but I wasn't at the place you want me to mention.
Well, no, where were you at? And then we'll mention the place.
Well, this was a private farm right in the middle of Rockland. And, of course, the busy time was just before the U.S. Thanksgiving and Christmas.
Sure.
And they sold mostly not over-the-counter retail, but they'd sell to the different food stores that were there. We would have some small ones. One was called Tedeschi's, and that was like, back in my time, 3 stores in 3 different towns, things like that.
Sure.
The other place where we would buy our turkeys, though, was a place called Bongi's.
Yes. And that's the place that I want. Because I remember when we were there, all I heard was, we have to go to Bongi's, we have to go to Bongi's. And I was like, what do we have to do at Bongi's? I didn't quite understand what it was.
Yeah.
And it was to buy a turkey.
Yes, Bongi's was located down in, I believe, Pembroke, south of us. And they sold retail over the counter.
Right.
And it was a family business. And as they developed, all of a sudden, the family was making pies,
Sure.
their own stuffing, everything you would need for a good Thanksgiving dinner, shall we say.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of people just found it much more convenient to go down there and load up.
Sure. So if you're in Massachusetts and you need a turkey, head to Pembroke, to Bongi's, and you can get the turkey, the stuffing, and the pie.
Yes.
Not that they sponsor our show, but I just figured we would make
Give
sure.
them a plug.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. Well, and now we're talking about Pembroke. What else is in Pembroke? If I remember, it was very pastoral, or it seemed like there was a lot of still farm areas there.
There was, especially when I was growing up. There was a lot of farmland available. The tide of people coming out of the Boston area to the South Shore hadn't gone that far yet.
I see.
And then, therefore, when they built a high school, you had 5 towns down there. And I can't think of all of them, but
Sure.
Pembroke, Plimpton,
Kingston?
Kingston was one, yeah.
Would Duxbury be another?
No, Duxbury was its own elite school.
Oh, I see. Why is Duxbury a desirable neighborhood? Is that?
It is,
Okay.
and it was. It's a small town. Its claim to fame really was back in the clipper ship days, where the ships would go over to China and bring the goods in.
Sure.
And it was quite a little hub for trade coming into the U.S. Small harbor right above Plymouth.
Right. We'll get to Plymouth in a moment, too. But since you did mention ship,
Yes.
didn't you work as a shipbuilder at one point?
Well, not really.
You always talk about that boat.
My family, my brothers, my father, relatives that go back generations were all shipbuilders.
I see.
And my father, during World War II, became the head of the machine shop at a place called Bethlehem Steel, later bought out by General Dynamics, quite a large shipbuilder in Quincy. And he was kind of a big shot in the shipyard.
Was Quincy known as a shipbuilding town?
It was.
Okay.
Yeah. You had a couple of shipbuilders in that area. You certainly had one in Boston, a very large one. Quincy was a little smaller, and during the war, they built a lot of military and Navy ships.
Sure.
The last thing they got into were liquefied natural gas ships.
Oh, wow.
Which were giants.
I bet.
And their docks couldn't hold them, so literally a third of the stern of those ships would stick out over the river.
Oh, wow.
As they built them. And it was great to get in a boat and go underneath and look up at these things.
Well, sure, natural gas is so difficult and dangerous to store, so you really have to have a ship that's large enough to store it and transport it. And that and I would imagine that would call for a large ship. You often mention when we see those, is it the Bostonian, those little there's these ships that you always, or these boats that you always point out, and you say, oh, that's a...
a Boston whaler.
Oh, Boston whaler, that's it.
That I did work there.
I thought so, okay.
Yes.
So tell me, where...
A boat builder.
Where is that, and what exactly is a Boston whaler?
Well, okay. When I got out of the Army, it was during a recession. It was very difficult to find work. And Boston Whaler was a local boat builder for pleasure boats.
In Quincy?
No, it was in Rockland, Mass.,
okay.
Right on the Rockland-Norwell line. And to give you some idea, literally right down the street from where I lived in Hanover. So it was like a mile and a half or so.
I see.
And I got a job there, worked there for a couple of years. And Boston Whaler was founded by two gentlemen. One was named Fisher, and Lord forgive me, I forgot the other gentleman's name.
That's fine.
But it was a partnership, and they literally built a couple of these boats by Fisher's design. Took them to a trade show, and their claim to fame was they cut one of their boats in half to show everybody it was unsinkable. And they used what was called foam construction, which is two layers and basically foam shot into the boat to give its buoyancy. And they cut it in half in such a way that one of the gentlemen put oars on the bow, and it floated, and he rolled around a little pond in back of the trade show. And in the stern, they put a small motor, and he circled his partner in this little pond, showing everybody. It was quite a demonstration. And from there, they grew, and it was almost like an overnight success at some point. But I joined them back in 1971, just as the year turned. And we made only three types of boats at that time, 13-footer, 16-footer, and then they introduced a 19-footer later on.
Wow! And what did you do? What was your job?
I was the receiver, quote unquote,
okay.
And the receiver had to take all the goods and document, get them in, etc. What you have to understand, this was a typical New England factory in that there were 7 buildings on site. So I was always running around to offload a truck somewhere.
Right. And is Boston Whaler still around today?
They are. They moved. What happened during my time is a union got voted in, and a company bought them out, and I should know their name, which I don't.
It's all right.
But they were already in boat building business, and they moved the facility down to Florida.
Oh.
Yeah.
Where you are now.
Right.
So it seems like the Boston Whaler is just following you around wherever you go.
Yeah, it seems that way. I mean, I've owned a few in my time, and they are good boats. We call them skimmers, or wave splashes, because they don't cut through waves. They kind of skim off the top because of their flat hull design.
Almost like when you throw one of those flat rocks across the water, right? Cohasset. You mentioned Cohasset. Tell me about Cohasset.
Cohasset, located just north of Scituate, was a town that really its heyday was in the Victorian age.
Oh, wow.
A lot of people would have had their cottages down there that lived in Boston. So on weekends and summer vacations, they would go down and enjoy the harbor and the coastline, the beaches, etc. It's another upscale community now, because some of those Victorian cottages were quite large.
And beautifully built, I bet.
Beautifully built, yes.
So now they command a respectable price, I guess.
Yeah, you're not going to get it at a cottage price.
I think Norwell, you kind of briefly mentioned Norwell.
Yeah. Norwell was another town that was spawned out of Scituate.
Oh, yeah, because you said that it was right on the border. The Boston Whaler was right on the border of Norwell.
That's right.
And
that's right. In fact, the corner of Norwell and Rockland in a town called Hingham is known as Accord. And Accord was when the Pilgrims and the Puritans divided up their colonies, and they had a border. And they started on the ocean, working inland, and their first stop after the first day was Accord.
I see.
And they named it Accord, and it's really nothing more than a area where a couple of roads come together nowadays. Wow. But there was a little pond there.
Okay.
And, of course, known as Accord Pond. And that's where these towns come together, if you will, the border.
So 3 towns are coming together in this area.
Yeah.
Wow. So now we've mentioned your general places in your general area of Hanover and Weymouth and Rockland, where you were born and grew up. What would be the reason you would have gone to Boston if you were living in Hanover or in Rockland when you were a kid? Why would you go into Boston?
Well, everything was moving out of the suburbs, so there was little reason. We didn't shop there. We didn't go there for any reason but maybe for entertainment purposes. Okay. I mean, you'd go in as kids, as a 12, 13-year-old kid. A group of us would go in on opening day for the Red Sox.
Oh, of course.
Now, back in those days, the Red Sox were lucky to be in 7th place at the end of the season. They weren't a real powerhouse. But we knew all the players, and for $2 you get a good seat in the grandstand, and for 50 cents you could go in the bleachers.
Okay.
So it was something that even we could afford, and a hot dog. I always remember a hot dog being like 25 cents to 50 cents. It wasn't much at all. So that was our lunch. We'd have a little change there that we could do that.
Sure.
The other games that we would try to take in were the Yankees, because we're from Boston. We hated the Yankees.
Of course.
And those were a little difficult times because a lot of Yankee fans would come up to it. And they were rather belligerent. I'll tell you, once we were there, had these good seats down the first baseline, and above us, we had these, we're only 12 or 13, we're just kids, and we had these guys, toughies out of New York, and they were slowly dripping beer on us.
Oh.
And the difficult part is we skipped school.
Right.
So how do you go home to your mother and you're smelling a beer?
She'd know that you were up to something in the big city. Well, I do want to say this. I want to thank you for this in-depth look at the South Shore and Boston. We're going to continue our conversation, but this will be the episode that we air on our podcast. If you want to hear the remaining part of this tour from Boston to the South Shore, please go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/The Insomnia Project, and you can hear more content. In fact, if you become a Sweet Dreamer sponsor, you can hear the rest of this conversation that I'm having with my father-in-law, Daniel Barker. Daniel, I want to thank you. Any quick tip if someone's visiting Boston, place you would recommend for them to go see?
Well, my recommendation would be to take in the historic part. There's something called the Freedom Trail that you can actually walk, and you go from Paul Revere's house to the famous churches, to the Common, etc. Quincy Market, etc. But definitely it's a historic city.
The lovely thing about the Freedom Trail is that it's free. You're just following a little trail which is marked with red bricks that brings you to all those historic places.
And people often ask me, where do you eat? And my only recommendation is the oldest restaurant in Boston. It's called the Union Oyster House. Now, if you're over 5'3", you might have to bend over to get in and get under the beams, but it's a very historic old little building, and I'll tell you, best fish and chips I've ever had in the world.
There you go.
Great clam chowder.
Indeed, perhaps the best in the world. Thank you so much, Daniel, for being with us for this particular episode.
Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure.
This episode was recorded in Toronto, Canada, and it was produced by Drumcast Productions. I want to thank you all for listening, and I encourage you to visit our Patreon page.